Hello viewers, it seems we need to talk again about tight pants because, well, where do we begin? I guess it's best to kind of go back in time and look at how this bizarre fixation on the part of Anthony Morris, governing body member, how this fixation has developed. Because it first came to our attention in January, or at least to my attention, in January of 2014, when Tony Morris visited the Italy branch and gave a talk in Rome, at which he gave the following comments.
Now, in America, and I know it's in Europe, here in Italy as well, they have what they call now the metrosexual look. It's becoming very popular. It's not new, but it's new that it's becoming so very popular. And what it means is that their suit, if they have a suit on, or their pants, extremely tight, all the way down to the ankles. Very, very tight. Now, you can see how Mauro and I are dressed. He's got a better physique than I do now. So it's not that you don't dress nice to fit your physique. That's fine. That's what Max and I do. What's wrong is this extremely tight pants. It's not appropriate for a Christian. And I want you brothers to think about this. Do you remember that many homosexuals are in the clothing industry and doing the designing? Don't you know they love it when you're wearing tight pants? Oh yeah, you chuckle. I don't think it's funny. I think it's disgusting. Think hard about it. You don't look as good as you think you could look, except to a homosexual.
So I remember thinking at the time that this was just absolutely extraordinary. I could barely believe what I was hearing. Here we had a governing body member using a visit to another country, to Italy, using that as an opportunity to warn of the scourge of tight pants, even to the point of suggesting that the whole thing was a conspiracy by homosexual fashion designers who were conspiring to basically perv on men by designing pants that are tight. This was what he was saying in front of an audience in Italy, and you could kind of tell, if you listen to the recording, you could tell that his comments were greeted with, although he was getting, he was getting laughter, a lot of it seemed to be sheer bewilderment that he was saying all this. But then he went and repeated the stunt in November of the same year, November 2014. He made the same comments at a US branch visit.
And the other one that needs addressing is for these young fellas, because the older ones aren't doing much of it, thankfully. It's the metrosexual look. We've addressed that in the past. We've said things about it. But what's happened now, it's really caught on more. Now, metrosexual, that's the tight suit jacket and the tight pants, better known as tight pants. And they are tight, I mean tight, all the way down to the ankles. And that is not modest, brothers. No. It's not appropriate. It's not sound of mind. And I was proud of one circuit overseer who told me this past summer at one of the international conventions, because he brought it up. One of these fellas shows up for his circuit overseer visit, and he wants to go out to ministry, work with him door to door, and he's wearing tight pants. And the circuit overseer was man enough, spiritual man enough to say, no, I'm not going door to door with you. Not with that dress on. Inappropriate. So a lot to think about, and you elders out there listening in, and be kind now. We always want to try to imitate Christ Jesus. You be spiritual man enough to tell these young fellas, you don't go out in the ministry looking like that. Not in this organization.
So again, you would assume that someone like Tony Morris, a religious leader of a religion boasting millions of followers, you would think that he would have more pressing things to talk about when given an opportunity to address, important issues. You'd think he'd have more important things to talk about than this ridiculous conjecture about tight pants. Really, it all smacks of his own personal opinions, which are being, because he happens to be a governing body member, which are then being kind of etched into law for Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, this whole thing became and continues to be, a subject of quite some humour for ex-witnesses like myself. And when in February 2015, I was given the opportunity, or an opportunity, to call Tony Morris, I couldn't help ribbing him about it.
Hello?
Oh, hello. Is that Brother Morris?
Yes?
Oh, hi, Brother Morris. It's Brother Cedars here. From the laundry room down on building 3.
Uh-huh.
A few of us were talking between ourselves today, Brother Morris, about the branch meeting talk. And we were thinking about, tight clothing, yoga pants, that kind of thing. And we were thinking, if we find some pants that are maybe too tight or some yoga pants, should we get in touch with you and let you know?
No. Talk to the branch committee.
The branch committee.
And don't let me see you guys wearing them.
Well, and I was.
Are you serious? You're pulling my leg.
Well, what if we find your pants and your pants are a bit too tight? Should we?
Then you must have shrunk them.
So I remember thinking at the time. I was bewildered to have got through when I was given the contact numbers and that kind of thing. I didn't fully expect it to work as well as it did. And so when suddenly I have Tony Morris on the line, I had in my mind like this joke to this kind of prank to pull. But I knew that if I started to talk seriously to him, which I did do, I kind of switched to speaking seriously, I knew he'd hang up, and that's precisely what ended up happening. But what's fascinating in that brief conversation is you can hear he's laughing. It's almost as though he himself doesn't take the whole tight pants thing seriously. But even so, and this is why I'm spending this time kind of going over the whole tight pants phenomenon, is because we're going to move to his very latest remarks, which were made at the branch visit to Trinidad on Saturday. So that's Saturday, January the 13th, 2018. He brings up the whole thing again. And I just, he talks about a number of things, not just tight pants, which we'll go through. But I just wanted to kind of give us some backdrop, give us some history to this. Because what we've essentially seen with the whole tight pants phenomenon is one governing body member's hang-ups and opinions becoming enshrined in Watchtower law, in Watchtower dogma. So if you look at the January 2017 study edition, you have there a picture showing a contrast between brothers wearing tight pants on the right and brothers not wearing tight pants on the left. And the caption says, "Can our dress and grooming show respect for Jehovah and others, or does it show a lack of modesty?" So we've reached the point where it's actually in the Watchtower that you shouldn't wear tight pants. And even more outrageously, in 2015, it might have been 2016 when we got the leak, but in any case, there was a document leaked, the Circuit Overseer Guidelines, dated October 2015. And incredibly, you have tight pants, the whole issue of tight pants and dressing immodestly as an issue that circuit overseers might be asked to deal with. So on one of the pages of the Circuit Overseer Guidelines, it says, if the body of elders agrees that a brother or sister is blatantly and deliberately ignoring repeated counsel, and his or her dress and grooming is disturbing to the congregation, the elders may determine that the person no longer qualifies to share in the ministry. In such rare cases, no announcement would be made to the congregation. So what it's saying here is that if you persist in dressing immodestly, which we know includes wearing tight-fitting pants, as a Jehovah's Witness, you can be banned from the preaching work. Now, we can laugh about this and we can say, well, actually, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing to actually be banned from bothering people at the door. But if you think about it, there's an enormous double standard here. And that's that when it comes to pedophiles, when it comes to known pedophiles in a congregation, Watchtower insists that they should still be allowed to participate in the preaching work. And we've had at least one documented case of someone on Megan's list being found going around homes in the preaching work. Granted, he was with others, he wasn't doing it by himself, but even so, when a pedophile is given that kind of license to call on families under the assumption that he's representing a church, and there's a degree of trust there. There are any number of possibilities for him to meet children and then kind of call back at another time by himself. So pedophiles, they need to be able to go out in the preaching work, but people who wear tight pants, oh no. They can be actually banned from the preaching work without there being so much as an announcement that they're banned. So there's an enormous double standard here that's a direct result of these outrageous ideas that Tony Morris is persistently putting out when a microphone gets put in front of him. And let's kind of just... I don't want to say too much before we look at the video, but it's worth bearing in mind when the comments do come up later that he's now been talking about this for 4 years. So it was January 2014 when he brings it up at his visit to the Rome branch, and 4 years later, here we are in January 2018, he's still banging the tight pants drum. So I just wanted to give all of this information to give some context to the discussion, but we're now going to go into the talk itself. So this is a talk that was given by Tony on January the 13th, 2018, in his visit to Trinidad. I've given pretty much most of the talk. I have clipped out some parts that were extraordinarily dull. But I'm going to show you now some of the most interesting parts of Tony's talk.
Well, it's my privilege to, as we customarily do, bring the love and greetings of the entire United States Bethel family and the rest of the governing body to all of you gathered here. Now, just to introduce this theme, is your family a spiritual family? Tell you a personal experience. Maybe, like me, you like birds. Jesus said to observe intently the birds of the heavens. So I've done that over the years. And I remember this one occasion, this one house we lived in at the time had a nice back porch there, and I could look out into the yard and just early in the morning observe the birds. And a lot of them I recognized. But this one day there was one particular bird that struck me, and it was about this size. It's a good size bird, much bigger than the smaller ones. and it had a very distinct brown head. And then the rest of the body was black, deep black. I'd never seen a bird like that before. It just struck me. What is that? You know? And been observing for some time here, a couple of years, and never saw a bird like that. Well, I had a book that would help me identify birds that are found in North America. So I went and got the book. And then you didn't have search the internet real quick, and even though I like the availability of some of these things, it's quick. But my book, I'm going through it, and then I found it. And it simply was just called a brown-headed cowbird. Not a great mind naming it, anything spectacular, but it was specifically a brown-headed cowbird. So apparently likes to be around farm areas, even though this was near the ocean, this brown-headed cowbird was there. Now, what does that have to do with whether your family's a spiritual family or not, this brown-headed cowbird? Well, as I was reading about the bird, here's what I learned. What these brown-headed cowbirds do, they will take and lay their eggs in another bird's nest. And it's a big bird, and they don't really care. Often they put it in a smaller bird's nest. Now, when the eggs hatch, guess what happens? The larger, small hatched brown-headed cowbirds, when the food starts coming that way, they're just over the top and taking all the food. And it causes all kinds of problems for these smaller birds where they invaded the nest. Well, it's unusual. I don't know if this was the way Jehovah would have intended it. I can't get into that. It's just, it is what it is, and this is what happens. Well, it occurred to me, as serving as an elder for years before that event and since, isn't that what happens sometimes in the congregation? So I've heard this with my own ears. The elders didn't do enough for my child. That's why they're not in the truth. The congregation just didn't support us enough. It's not my fault, it's their fault. Well, scripturally, whose responsibility is it primarily to raise a child or children? You know the answer.
So I've included this rather long clip, and this, by the way, is the longest of the clips I'm going to show you. The rest are going to be a bit shorter. But there's a few things here. First of all, and most obviously, is the kind of sneering, condescending way in which he's addressing the audience here. He's giving this caricature of Jehovah's Witness parents who are criticizing the elders for not doing enough if their children stop believing. And the way he kind of impersonates such parents kind of gives a fascinating insight into how he looks at ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly those that don't meet with his expectations. And this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the talk. He does this a lot. The other thing to notice is how he just kind of glosses over. I mean, he's come up with this illustration of a very convoluted, I might add, illustration, which essentially amounts to, here's how I found out about this bird. So he wastes minutes just talking about how he found out about it, when he could just say, there's this bird that does this. But the fact that the brown-headed cowbird lays its eggs in another bird's nest and does what the cuckoo does, which is it basically stops chicks of another bird from getting food, he kind of glosses over the ugly side of that and he isn't interested in exploring why God would create the brown-headed cowbird to do that. He's not really interested in that. He's only interested in how this fits in with his illustration, which brings me to my third and final observation, which is that he hasn't really explained, at least in this talk, why this illustration is relevant. So he gives this illustration of the brown-headed cowbird putting its chick in another bird's nest, and then the other bird's chicks being sidelined and jeopardized by the brown-headed cowbird chick. But he doesn't explain how this is relevant to witnesses saying, oh, the elders didn't do enough. He just launches into this tirade without explaining what the relationship is, without essentially explaining his analogy. And I was genuinely confused about this until I remembered that Tony Morris gives the same illustration 4 years ago, because this is basically a less coherent version of the talk that he gave in Rome 4 years ago. And he gives exactly the same illustration in Rome, but actually applies it properly. Here's a clip to demonstrate.
So when it comes to our family, you never want to be a brown-headed parent. Don't expect the elders or someone else to raise your children. Whether you're a single parent or both of you, your children, like we sang in the song, are a sacred trust to you.
So now at least we know the purpose of his analogy. He's saying that Jehovah's Witness parents who fail to look after their children properly and who then complain when they don't end up being witnesses are like the brown-headed cowbird, because they're essentially placing them as the elders' responsibility for the elders to essentially act as their parents. So that's the purpose of his analogy. We know this because we've been able to listen to when he was giving a more coherent version of this talk 4 years ago. But if you're in the audience in Trinidad, I would imagine you'd be scratching your head thinking, what is he going on about? This just seems to be him giving an anecdote about spotting a bird and then launching into a tirade against parents who blame elders for their children falling out of the truth.
Whether you're a single parent or a couple with a child or children, you have to understand something. The biggest influence to whether they'll stay with the truth or not, in my experience, and other elders will completely agree with this, it's the parent or parents. You're going to impact them more than anybody. Now, others have helped, and there are some occasional exceptions, but down through the years, I've noticed that if the parent or the parents don't do the spiritual thing, the average of them staying with the truth, it just goes down. Now, that's not to say some cases, some couples are spiritual or a single parent is spiritual, did the best they could. Well, even when you do your best, some don't stay with it.
So this is another recurring theme, not just in this talk, but I've noticed increasingly in talks given by other governing body members, and that's this concern about children being indoctrinated. We need to have children indoctrinated, and because we realize that if children aren't indoctrinated as witnesses, how on earth are we going to persuade them as adults? How on earth are we going to convince people to join the religion once they are matured and have their critical thinking skills up and running? So this is something that Tony Morris is clearly, keenly concerned about. This whole thing of, well, you know, children will fall away from the organization unless Jehovah's Witness parents take seriously their responsibility to indoctrinate them.
So that is something you have to deal with. We're all free to choose if we're going to worship the true God. The apostates and our enemies accuse us of being a cult. I hate that when they address that with us, but they throw this out there. I've been all over the world, and here I am now in the auditorium here in Trinidad. I haven't seen anybody dragged in here with a chain. And once you sat down, I haven't seen anybody chained to that chair or glared at by the attendants if you dare to move to get up and leave. That's a cult. That's what cults do. See? So anyway.
So this is one of the most fascinating parts of Tony's talk. In Tony's mind, in Tony's troubled, slightly confused mind, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't a cult because nobody forcibly attends Jehovah's Witness meetings. Nobody is shackled or tied or chained to their chair. And nobody is made to feel bad if they get up while a meeting is in progress and leave the building. In Tony's mind, that means that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't a cult. But what he's obviously completely ignoring is that it has nothing to do with whether you are forced to attend specific meetings. The reason why people call Jehovah's Witnesses a cult is because it very much is a captive organization, because you are threatened with family estrangement if you decide to leave. You don't need to have actual physical bonds or chains at the meeting for there to be coercion, for there to be pressure, for there to be threats made against you if you decide to leave the organization and speak out against it. But funnily enough, this is a logic that Tony Morris isn't using here for the first time. He's used it before. We're now going to go to an older talk of his in which he basically makes the same point.
And remember, they did the wrong. The organization didn't do anything wrong. You knew when you became a witness you don't live right, you're going to get disfellowship. We don't have closed doors at Kingdom Hall, ropes to tie people into seats. We do this because we volunteered to become Jehovah's people.
So this was also from Tony's Rome 2014 talk, if I recall. And it's the same appalling logic where he's saying, well, look, we can't be accused of anything bad if there aren't any physical ropes or chains or bonds on people when they are at the Kingdom Hall. He goes one step further here and says they chose, people who were disfellowshipped, they chose to become Jehovah's Witnesses. It's all their fault, essentially, which is something that he returns to. But again, what he's ignoring is that you don't really choose something if you're not given all of the information. So, for example, I chose to get baptized at the age of 11 when I was too young to fully understand what I was getting involved in. I certainly didn't have all the facts at my disposal as I have now. I wasn't of legal age, so if I'm not allowed to get employed or sign a contract or go into debt, how can I be allowed to make a lifelong commitment to a religion? But in any case, even if I was to have got baptized as an adult, I should be allowed to change my mind. But you're not allowed to change your mind once you get baptized as a witness if you have your family turned against you as a weapon if you decide to leave. And that's, again, what Tony Morris is absolutely overlooking with this logic.
Let's just keep in mind, it's our responsibility as a parent. You have to take that. I know it's weighty, it's heavy. My wife and I raised two sons. They chose to serve Jehovah God. They make us look good. We're proud of them. They really do. But they chose to do this and to serve Him full time. So it's a wonderful privilege to have that, but you have to be sure, and the greatest impact, that's why we have this question, we have families all over the world. If they have an opportunity to live, it's only going to be because the family was spiritual.
Let's just focus on those last few words. If they have an opportunity to live, it's only going to be because the family was spiritual. In other words, if the family isn't spiritual, according to Tony's requirements, which we're going to learn about in greater detail as the talk proceeds, if they're not suitably spiritual, they're not going to have an opportunity to live, i.e., they're going to be destroyed. This is what's at stake here. People's lives are at stake in Tony's mind. And this is going to be revisited in the talk, this kind of doomsday narrative that witnesses have. And frankly, I'm relieved. I'm relieved that when governing body members like Tony get in front of an audience that have no choice but to clap like seals at everything they say, I'm relieved that they finally, in these situations, have the bravery to spell out Jehovah's Witness theology as it truly is. Because I've lost count now of the number of times where someone's replied to one of my videos where I've talked about, well, you know, you're going to be destroyed, Armageddon, supposedly, if you're not one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I've lost count of the number of times where witnesses have said, oh, it's not like that. That's not what we believe. The resurrection of the unrighteous, blah, blah, blah. And they've gone on to totally misrepresent what Jehovah's Witness theology is all about. But here, when you listen to Tony Morris speaking, and he's a governing body member, you hear it spelled out very, very clearly. And it's gonna, if you think this was bad, you should hear what he says later on.
The Bible has foretold, long before the last days began, that there's going to be a vicious attack on the family arrangement. It's been in Scripture for a long time. Satan's behind it. And you look at the world today, and he has pretty well come to the point where in so many countries the family they're obliterated. There's nothing there. Even in some countries where families were so strong, not now. You have same-sex marriage. See, all these different ones that want to choose this other immoral lifestyle, and how dare you say anything about it, you judgmental individual. Who do you think you are? I was born this way. Things like that. So the devil has made sure that's where we are. Now, the sad thing is, it's affected some in the congregation. The attack.
So this is before we've even got to the tight pants part. Tony's already talking about homosexuals. Frankly, I don't know of any governing body member ever who has had so much to say when a microphone is put in front of him, completely unprompted. He's not being asked to comment on same-sex marriage. No one's really interested in his opinion, quite frankly. But it seems that on multiple occasions now, when he's, put on a platform and given a microphone, this is what, in his mind, is one of the most important things to talk about, is how dare people, love people of the same gender? How dare there be marriage equality? How dare people love who they want, how they want? This, for Tony, is one of the most pressing issues of the age. And I can't help but sympathize with those who say that this is a case, this might be a case, or is a case of protesting too much. Thou dost protest too much. You can't help but wonder whether this is a case of someone protesting about something that they secretly or at some level have an affinity for. But there's also, just the general tone of this. You'll have seen how he talks about the family being obliterated. In his view, everything outside the Jehovah's Witness organization is just wasteland when it comes to morality, when it comes to family cohesion. It's impossible in this man's mind for people to be living happy, satisfied, kind, loving lives outside of his organization. And that's one of the biggest shortfalls, I think, with the Jehovah's Witness mindset, is that unless you are in this bubble, in this spiritual paradise, there's no hope for you. You're just going to be a selfish, greedy, depraved, immoral person, and a very unpleasant person to be around if you're not one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
This is all to help you. The enemy has been attacking the families in this organization for decades. He's not letting up. So it's up to you. We can admonish you. We can caution you, encourage you with what works, but you're making the choices. And we're counting on and confident that you'll make the right choices.
I've actually, by this point, watched a lot of Tony Morris talks going back a number of years. And this is something he says in more or less every talk. That, listen, some of this counsel, some of this admonishment is going to be very straightforward and very blunt. But we're doing this to help you. And this is actually all of your choice. It's entirely up to you. Almost like it's on a take it or leave it basis as to whether they accept the admonishment or not, whether they correct their wayward course. But again, it's completely ignoring the fact that in his view, you're going to die if you don't accept his version of spirituality. And actually, if you don't fall in line, there's every possibility of you being disfellowshipped and estranged from your family. That's the level of control that Tony and his colleagues are insisting upon, but for some reason they don't allude to it when they are suggesting that all of this is on a take it or leave it basis.
Been years since people, a lot of them don't use them much anymore, but if you went hiking in an unknown area, you take a compass so that you don't get lost in that jungle in some cases or some forest, because the compass will always point north. So at least you know, well, I'm heading north. Well, that's the way a spiritual family is with Jehovah God. And anything, all affairs of life, points right at Jehovah. That's all. That's all that's ever on their mind, because we worship him. See, now, if you did that for some other human, well, I can't make a move unless I talk to brother so-and-so. No, that's not what we're encouraging. It's Jehovah God. And if that elder's pointing to the guidance in Scripture, if you have good sense, you'll be spiritual and take it to heart.
Tony Morris is very open about the fact that being a Jehovah's Witness is about ceding control over all affairs of life. So all affairs of life must be brought into alignment with what Jehovah expects. And if you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, you might be thinking, well, that's perfectly reasonable. Why wouldn't God be involved in all affairs of life? But when you get out of the kind of witness mindset, you realize that it's not actually Jehovah that you're ceding control to. You're ceding control to an organization. And there's this irony in what Tony Morris is saying, is that he's saying, well, we don't follow humans, we don't follow elders, everything is following Jehovah. But what he means is everything is following what we are interpreting Jehovah's will to be. When it gets to the point where you can be punished just for wearing trousers that are a tight cut, then you know that it's not purely about following Jehovah. It's most definitely about following men.
When we first started asking questions for people getting baptized, the theme of that book was based on this verse. We used to call it the lamp book. And what a wise decision to go over all these questions so people can't say after they're baptized, well, I didn't know what I was doing. Elders say, no, they were conscious when we talked to them and asked the questions. Nobody passed out. They weren't in a coma. This is what was considered.
This, for me, was one of the most infuriating parts of Tony's talk. This is where he's essentially sneering at those like me who say you cannot hold someone to their baptism dedication to the point of insisting that they are estranged by their family members for a decision they made very often when they were children. You can't make a child pledge something and then hold them to it for the rest of their lives with family estrangement, the punishment if they ever go back on their decision. And Tony here is saying, well, that's not the case because nobody passed out, no one was unconscious. Everyone who gets baptized has to go through these questions, and that's how we know they're serious. Well, yes, I was serious when I got baptized. I may have been 11, I may have been a legal minor, but I was very serious about my decision to get baptized. But I'd also been lied to, and that's what Tony is overlooking. The fact that it doesn't matter what questions you were asked, and it doesn't matter what questions you agree to, if you've been lied to, and if you've been brought to a position where you're believing those things based on deception, then you shouldn't be held accountable if you later turn around and say, actually, those questions were based on a belief system that is fundamentally not true.
Jehovah's word is far superior, and what leads is not human wisdom. See, we don't go by, even though you have medical treatment or whatever, but when you get into some of these decisions in life and what's acceptable or isn't acceptable, spiritual families don't go, well, there's this famous doctor you-know-who says thus and so. You know what I say? Whoopee. You want to go that way? That's your decision. I think I'll stick with my Creator, and am not ashamed at all to say anybody with any sense will go with the Creator. This is His Word. This is what lights our way. This is the wise way. And sure, you know, like one old anointed sister knew years back, and I thought it was nice. Maybe you've heard something similar. For us as Christians, you know, you can compare it to a fish in a stream. We're always swimming upstream, like salmon in certain parts of the world. They have to get back to where they're going to lay their eggs in that again. But it's a struggle. So we have the same thing. No one said ever that this was going to be easy. It's been compared by Christ Jesus to carrying a torture stake. It's like we're swimming upstream against the spirit of the world. Why be surprised? Sure, it's a struggle, but this is what we do. And we go by Jehovah's wisdom.
So this part of the talk was difficult to decipher in terms of what exactly Tony was talking about. And as the talk progresses, I mean, maybe you're picking up on this already, but this is not one of the most coherent talks Tony's ever given. I'm actually of the opinion that he's perhaps fading on the evidence of this talk. His talks generally tend to be quite rambling and backwards and forwards and difficult to make sense of. But this one is particularly like that. And he talks here about a doctor, a so-called doctor, and his opinion. Now, he could be talking about one of two things. He could be talking about blood transfusions, and if a doctor says you need a blood transfusion, Tony Morris says, well, whoop-de-doo. I think I'll stick with the Creator. That could be what he's talking about. Or he could be talking about this.
The church has basically shunned your wife now because of her position, and you're labeled an apostate. I've always had the attitude, if I go somewhere and my wife and family aren't welcome, then I'm not welcome. And if somebody tells me that I am to shun my wife and children, they can kiss my ass. And I don't.
Now, bear in mind, the Dr. Phil episode aired on January 8th, and then on January 13th, Tony Morris climbs on a platform and says,
There's this famous doctor you know who says thus and so. You know what I say? Whoopee. You want to go that way? That's your decision. I think I'll stick with my Creator, and I'm not ashamed at all to say anybody with any sense will go with the Creator.
So I guess this is one of those areas where you, the audience, have to decide, what was Tony Morris talking about? Was he talking about blood transfusions, or was he talking about the Dr. Phil episode? By the way, I have conflicting ideas about the Dr. Phil episode, which I'm not going to go into now, but he certainly had some interesting remarks to make, shall we put it, about shunning and about apostates and that side of things that are valid. He made some valid observations. And again, just a matter of, I think, 4 or 5 days later, Tony Morris gets on a platform and says this. You guys will have to decide, but what we certainly can say is that Tony's remarks are difficult to understand and make sense of. And this is by no means the only part of the talk where that can be said.
If you're a married couple and you're both baptized witnesses, you're a family. I don't understand why sometimes the light didn't go on, apparently. When you're a married couple, in God's eyes, you are a family. So that means family worship. And we put that on an early broadcast, JW broadcast, because the teaching committee had observed, and we had that video put together. Sometimes some couples have raised their children, and they stayed in the truth, the children, but with them gone, their family worship fell aside. And so we put it there and for what it is. And of course, we ended it positive where the couple talked about it, they got it together, because they were inclined to do the spiritual thing. So any of us, if we're not careful, you can get off track. And beware of overconfidence, because the devil loves that. You come up with this, and I've mentioned this in the past. You think you're smart? Matching wits with the devil? Oh, he, please come try. Oh, yeah. So you get that little lack of humility, and you start thinking highly of yourself, you have become primary target, because he's saying, I'm going to devour him or her. And he does from time to time, which is sad.
There's two fascinating things about this part of the talk. Firstly, there's the extremely condescending way in which he talks about married couples who don't consider themselves families for the purpose of doing family worship. So if you're not a Jehovah's Witness, basically witnesses are supposed to come together, witness families, that is, are supposed to come together once a week and do family worship, which is essentially an indoctrination session. They go through material that they choose for themselves, whether it's a video or whether it's a book or whatever, and they remind themselves of the need to be devout Jehovah's Witnesses. And Morris is here bemoaning the fact that the light hasn't gone on with some witness couples who don't think that this applies to them. Very kind of sneering, condescending approach that he takes. And the other thing which I find fascinating is where he starts talking about Satan devouring Jehovah's Witnesses who are complacent, or in his view, not humble. Apparently Tony is in a position to lecture us on humility as someone who believes that he is a mouthpiece for God. But no, he believes that anyone who doesn't listen to what he has to say, anyone who doesn't share his opinion, anyone who doesn't take on board his advice is going to get devoured by Satan. This isn't a cult, by the way.
So be careful. Each family now, when it comes to the text, for example, and we'll talk about family worship a little more in a couple of minutes, but Jehovah's reasonable. Everybody's doing our best to imitate him and be reasonable. You might do the text in the evening, whatever family circumstances are. You might not be able to do it in the morning like the Bethel family does, and many families do. The point is, do you do it sometime that day? Rather than to the child's heading off to school, did you read the text? Sounds like I'm giving spiritual direction. Excuse me? When we say do the text, it's not bark in some order. Sit down and do something with them. Discuss it. If you can't do it in the morning because of work circumstances or whatever, I just suggest you all have the habit and pass on to your child or children. Look at it before you leave. Make sure you examine it. And then when you get home and I get home, we're going over it. And if you do it then, fine. The point is, spiritual families do it whenever they can schedule it, but they do it. That's the point.
So I realise it could be that you've never been a Jehovah's Witness and you're wondering what on earth he's going on about at this point when he's talking about doing the text. Basically, Jehovah's Witnesses have a publication examining the scriptures daily, which has a Bible verse for each day of the calendar year. And the theory is that they're supposed to read this verse and the accompanying comments, which are usually taken from a previous Watchtower article. And this is their way of, on a daily basis, so basically when you wake up almost, here's your reminder of what you're supposed to believe. Very, very culty when you kind of think about it. But I just find it fascinating that, again, you have this kind of sneering, condescending, caricaturing of witnesses who don't do the day's text, or, in his view, bark orders at their children, telling them to have done it by themselves when they're on their way to school. I feel as though these little caricatures that Tony Morris does, where he's having these imaginary conversations, offer a fascinating insight into just how he views ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly those that don't do things as he would like. He really does seem to look down his nose at witnesses who aren't doing things according to his interpretation of what spirituality is all about.
Now, don't make this mistake. And I, for one, I like the availability. We have the broadcast. We have in other television programs are nice to keep up with the news. But please, you know what happens. If they do have a meal together at the table, what's on? The TV. Everybody's feeding themselves and the TV's dictating. Excuse me. Physical family? Expect it. Yeah. How do you think they came up, and I have one, so I'm not being over-righteous, but TV dinner trays. Did you forget why they came up with that? The advertisers, or they want you there, and that's a good idea. And I've eaten a meal off a TV dinner tray, but some circumstance, but my wife goes to the effort of cooking. We're going to sit down together. We glean something from the Bethel dining room. It has an impact, especially if you have children. We always ate as a family, at least one meal a day, given some other extraordinary circumstances, because this is family time. Even the world knows it's important. And we don't find ourselves enamored with what they recommend most of the time, but their experts say, boy, it fosters these bonds with the family. And the ones that have that stay away from the drugs and the gangs and such. See, and that's something that works with gangs, because if you don't have a bond with your parent or parents, they will get you to bond with them. And they're smart at it. Very smart at it. Because guess who's behind them? Satan himself. So.
This for me is just vintage Tony Morris. And when I say vintage, I mean not in a good way. This is because, again, this is probably the most incoherent talk I've heard him give. But this is where he is again self-indulging in imposing his own opinion as spiritual law when it comes to, eating as a family. And don't get me wrong, I agree with him largely that it's better to not have the television on when you're having a family meal. I even agree with him that it's good to sit down as a family rather than eat separately. Those are things that we do in my family. But to give this advice in such a sneering, patronizing manner, where you're again caricaturing those who you are supposed to be trying to reach out to and saying, oh, this is what they do. Surely any kind of mature person who understands the rudiments of human psychology knows that that is not how you reach out to people. That's not how you appeal to people and get them to change their behavior, by making them feel like teenagers who you're telling off. And it was also fascinating how he talks about even in the world, they say this, and experts say that it forges bonds within the family. And he almost admits himself that he's cherry picking what parts of the world he agrees with and in other areas entirely dismissing what experts say. You have to do that when you are a governing body member. We've seen it with David Splain. You have to appeal to scientists and experts when it suits your agenda and completely ignore them when they say something that contradicts your views. To be more consistent and intellectually honest, you're better off doing one or the other, either taking on what experts say or ignoring them entirely. To do it in this kind of cherry-picking way is very disingenuous.
When you do have your meal together and you're enjoying that time and maybe discuss the text for the day and scriptural thought here, please, and listen carefully, this is not the time while you're eating or that time when you're together to scold them. Look, you punk. No. It's family time. You don't want them thinking about, oh boy, here we go, I'm going to get scolded again because your child is imperfect. It's a nice time together. So if you've done that, just say, Jehovah, forgive me. I'm going to stop it. I'm not going to scold my child or children when we're having a meal. Now, do they need discipline? Of course they do. But don't just barking off scolding at dinner time. No, it's not appropriate.
I can't help but wonder whether this is a case of Tony Morris projecting here. So maybe in his experience growing up, he's had this scenario where he's sat down for a meal and been scolded by his parents, by his father. Who knows? But it kind of feels very personal when he's giving this advice, as though he has been on the receiving end of that kind of upbringing. But I also just can't help but notice the irony of him saying, well, when we sit down for a meal, we don't want to be using it as an opportunity to scold one another. We want to be upbuilding. And he's saying that in a talk that is supposed to be spiritual food. It's supposed to be a spiritual banquet in which he is essentially scolding his audience, making them feel like, chastised teenagers with these outrageous caricatures where he is patronizing and condescending and making them feel as though they're being told off.
Stop and think about the war of the great day of Jehovah the Almighty. If you haven't lately, just slow down and pause. Now, personally, I was in a war, in the Vietnam War, in the middle of all kinds of bombing and casualties and all sorts of things, the trauma from war. So I've seen it. Now, you could see a goat or a cow hit by a car on the side of the road, see humans like that. It's different.
One of the things I find most fascinating about Tony Morris, and as you've probably guessed by now, I follow him quite closely. I kind of consider myself his number one troll in a way. But I am fascinated by him. And if you read his story, I forget which watchtower it was in now, I'll put a reference for you. He tells his life story, and he mentions the fact that he was in Vietnam, and he talks briefly about, he kind of paints a picture where you are left wondering whether he suffered from PTSD as a result of his Vietnam experience. And actually, I've talked about, have I talked? No, I've done a video where he's discussed his Vietnam experience in more detail. I'll put a link in the description below where he talks about serving as a medical officer in the Vietnam War. I haven't seen any formal records, by the way, but I have to give him the benefit of the doubt that all of this is legit and he really did serve. But when you're reading his life story, it kind of becomes apparent that he is a sufferer of PTSD from his experience in the Vietnam War, and that experience informs his fanaticism in a way when it comes to being a governing body member and the kind of grim doomsday narrative that he seems to revel in. Now, you've seen a glimpse of that just now, where he's talking about Armageddon, and he's saying, "Oh, I've seen bombing, I've seen carnage," and if you think you've seen it bad, if you think you have it bad seeing a deer that's been hit by the side of the road, that's only a glimpse of what's coming, and those remarks are very similar to what Tony says in the following clip, which is from the 2009-2010 Special Assembly Day in a talk he gave titled "The Time Left is Reduced. How Will You Use It?"
You see, I was in Vietnam, a medic in that war. I've seen what happens to humans when they're mangled. You see it on TV and some of that. Well, till you smell human flesh burning from a helicopter crash. People that look like humans, like a hot dog on a grill, blackened and splitting open. I know what's coming at Armageddon. A lot of dead people. A lot of dead people. So it's absolutely urgent for us to get our minds off ourselves
And let's get out there and help as many as we can, because when it comes, it's going to be numbing for you. You think seeing a deer mangled on the side of the road from a truck that hit it is upsetting? You see humans like that. So it's going to be numbing.
So again, I can't help but wonder whether the person that Tony Morris has become is thanks in large part to what he went through in the Vietnam War, and how sad in a way that one man's experience is shaping the organisation to make it so unloving, so unmerciful, so domineering, and is really kind of, in a way, feeding into a doomsday narrative that was always there, but Tony seems to almost be reveling in it to the point where he actually enjoys, or seems to enjoy, thinking about how much carnage there will be at Armageddon, and using this vision that he almost seems to view himself as a prophet in this regard, using that as an instrument of control and saying, well, listen, I've seen what's going to happen if you don't take seriously what I'm telling you.
So I've personally always worked as hard as I can as I get older. It's not easy to do as much as I used to do, but I know what's coming. And sometimes people can be so rude, hateful in our ministry or whatever, and I get thinking about what the Bible foretells is you can go to a supermarket, place where you're shopping for food, and look around. See, how many of them are going to make it? So it kind of slows you down and say, well, go ahead, they're going to act that way. But see, the scriptures say this, and it's very sobering, and we don't pound away at this, but it's what it is. Jeremiah foretold, and here's what he said. Jehovah inspired him. Those slain by Jehovah will certainly come to be in that day from one end of the earth clear to the other end of the earth. So here in Trinidad, Tobago, Guyana, there'll be dead people everywhere. Oh yeah. It's going to shake you up. You're probably going to be down on your knees. But that's what's coming. It's a reality. So we cannot overemphasize families studying with their children. Because if they're still living under your roof and part of your family, you got to ask yourself, are they going to make it? Now, sometimes, as we've said, if they're a toddler and they're not at an age where Jehovah's going to hold them responsible, that'll be up to him to determine. But you have to understand something. Jehovah's angels will do exactly what he tells them to do, because they know he does not make mistakes.
Unquestionably, this was the most chilling part of the talk, and there's more stuff to come that's along these lines, but this is where he is at his most fanatical when it comes to the doomsday narrative, and he's saying, oh, it's going to shake you up. He's almost telling his audience that he's prepared, but they're not. He knows what's coming. He's seen it. But his audience is naive and complacent. And they're going to be shocked when they see the bodies in Trinidad, Tobago and Guyana. Because he quotes this scripture, which he is quite fond of quoting. If you listen to his talks, he's constantly quoting from the verse in Jeremiah about those slain being from one end of the earth clear to the other end of the earth. And what's interesting is he says, we don't pound away at this, but it is what it is. And when he says we, he obviously means the governing body. And he's saying, listen, we don't make a big deal in our publications about this doomsday narrative, but this is what we think. And I actually think that there's a dishonesty there, because I think it's fairly obvious why the governing body doesn't talk in these terms in the literature. It's because people would be outraged, people would be appalled at how cult-like the organization is if they were to show their true colors and talk the way Tony Morris has just talked in their publications or in their videos. They know how that would make them look, and they don't want to look like that. So they keep their most grotesque musings about carnage and death and massacre and blood for these one-off events where Tony gets to say, well, here's how it really is. This is the inside story. This is what we're not going to say in the publications, but this is what we really think. I wish every Jehovah's Witness or everyone who's interested in becoming a Jehovah's Witness could just listen to those few minutes that I've just played, just to understand the level of fanaticism at the very pinnacle of the organization. It really is a doomsday cult. And when I call it a doomsday cult and others call it a doomsday cult, we are not exaggerating.
See, so it's very serious. That's why you look at, like the Apostle Paul, he could write about the brothers he knew personally in Philippi, and he could say this, that how you obeyed me, not just during my presence only, but in my absence. So the reason I bring that up is, as a parent, that always stayed with me, and should stay with you parents that have children, maybe they're in school. Do they only obey you in your presence? Find out. They have to obey you in your absence. Now it's between them and Jehovah God. Jehovah has to be real to them, not just you as a parent. They'll love you, they'll feel that bond because that's the way Jehovah created us. But if you're not sure, you've got to find out. And frankly, family worship is going to play that large role as to whether they're going to survive. And you have to be consistent. You have to be practical and try to make it enjoyable as possible.
Yes, family worship should be as enjoyable as possible. As enjoyable as it can possibly be, considering that you're going to die if you don't have it. He literally said that family worship is going to play a large role as to whether a child is going to survive, meaning Armageddon, meaning what he's just said about the dead being from one end of the earth clear to the other end. In that context, in that grim, grotesque, morbid, macabre, doomsday context, he's saying, oh, by the way, don't forget family worship, because that's what's waiting for your kids if Armageddon comes and they are not suitably in line with what we want them to believe.
So that you understand, if you want to argue with God, go ahead. You're going to lose, but you're a free moral agent. I find this over the years, personally dealing with folks, and they're arguing with what's in the scriptures. Because, see, God's not real enough to them. They're just looking at this elder, barking at him. See, no matter how mild, how kind you say it, they're being corrected, not taking this. Well, this is not the organization for that kind of thinking. Nope.
If you had to choose a video clip, any video clip, to sum up the arrogance and the delusion and the just sheer pig-headedness of the governing body, I would choose this one. Because we're seeing here a man who quite clearly presumes to speak for God and who is telling his followers that if they don't follow what he's telling them, then they are going against what God requires. And then he has the gall to say, we're all free moral agents. We have freedom to decide. Well, no, not quite, Tony. Because if your God is going to massacre us if we don't fall in line with your requirements, that's not much of a choice, is it?
So, how are spiritual families when it comes to dress and grooming? Boy, that gets personal, doesn't it? So, we stick with the principles. And this goes for all the cultures, all the parts all over the earth. Culture's wonderful. I've learned some interesting sayings here in Trinidad. I like them, you know. Of course, I'm sure there's a lot more. Maybe I wouldn't like them all. I can't say for sure. But I observed it. I love that expression, and I'll use it more. And I did find time, busy as we were this week, to do a little liming, you know. Which is not a lot, but... And one best light, when I put that on him, he started to walk away, and he turned around and... What's this guy talking about? Where did he get that? But if culture conflicts with Bible principle, guess what? The Bible principle rules. That's it, in this organization.
I wish we'd had those sentiments expressed. I think it was in the Remember the Wife of Lot video where they go round to the couple's house.
Yeah, so we enjoy the best parts of all cultures. We just avoid the parts that God disapproves of.
Like what? Well, for example, my mother still prepares food to offer to our dead ancestors on special days.
And yet here we have the other side, you know, again, once the governing body are there in person and they're feeling very free in front of the microphone, suddenly all the truth comes out. And guess what? If there is a conflict between culture and what the governing body says, guess who wins? As was so straightforwardly put by Tony. Also just interesting to see the charisma in action. And one thing that you can say about Tony, for all of his quirks, for all of his delusions, for all of his narcissism, he is a charismatic figure. He just is. I mean, all of the best cult leaders are charismatic. And you see here a degree of charisma in action. He's got the audience eating out of his hands, even though he's just been telling them some really grotesque things about Armageddon. And, oh, well, you know, when you go to the supermarket, you just look round at all of the people who are going to die. And if you think you've seen, if you think it's bad seeing a deer hit by a car, you should see what's in store at Armageddon. He's just said that, and yet he's still able to get a laugh by talking about liming. And I actually did research this. I've never heard of the expression. Apparently it's something to do with, it's like a local phrase to refer to socializing. And it also has a connotation of loitering. So there are signs apparently in Trinidad that say no liming, which means no loitering here. So basically, he's, as far as I understand, correct me if you're from Trinidad and I'm expressing this wrongly, as far as I understand, liming refers to socializing. But again, he's able to get a laugh. He has charisma. If we have to give him anything, we certainly need to give him that.
We're supposed to, as Christians, dress modestly. Modestly. What's appropriate? What's respectable? Now, this is as ministers of the true God, Jehovah God, is expecting us to show respect to him primarily, and to our brothers and sisters. Now, I'll let you know this, your branch committee reports that they're concerned about some here in the branch territory when it comes to brothers and sisters. And that's not new, it's not just Trinidad, we see it in other parts of the world, because guess who is pushing this? And this one here, it's been around a little bit, but it's really catching on in a lot of countries. And young men, they're wearing these tight suits. The suit jacket's tight, and then the pants are tight all the way down. I'm a big guy. And some say, well, you wouldn't look good in one anyway. That's why you don't want one, you know? Sorry, buddy. I would never disrespect my Heavenly Father and dress like that. No.
Everybody's looking at my tight pants. I got my tight pants. I got my tight pants on.
So, honestly, what do you make of that? What I find fascinating, and this is a recurring theme, whenever we see Tony bring up tight pants, as he's been doing it for 4 years now. That's how long he's been beating this drum. And whenever he does it, he gets a laugh. There's this weird dynamic going on with the audience where they're finding him genuinely hilarious because it is funny. I mean, this is comedy gold right here. But there's this dynamic whereby they're finding it funny and they can't help but laugh at him. And believe me, a lot of this is laughing at him. But at the same time, he's deadly serious. He is deadly serious. He's not doing this for a joke. He may have been laughing with me when I phoned him. He's somehow able to compartmentalize things so that he can see the funny side. But at least at some level, he is dead serious about this. He really believes that God is offended by pants that are too tight, to the point where he's made it his personal crusade. And what an odd thing to witness, him doing that little twirl. Apparently he is the role model. The way Tony Morris dresses, and thankfully he's given us the model twirl there. However Tony Morris dresses is the way we need to dress. And wouldn't you know, the way Tony Morris dresses and the way most of the governing body dress just happened to be fixed around about the 1950s. So 1950s style is what we need to be sticking to in the 21st century, because that's when, for whatever reason, that's the decade that was picked as the standard for what represents modest dress. I also find it intriguing that Tony has to present this information as though he's just the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger, because it's actually the branch committee that are concerned about this. So this isn't just my personal beef with tight pants. Forget the fact that I've been banging this drum in various parts of the world for 4 years now. No, apparently the Trinidad branch, if we're to believe this, wrote to Tony Morris and said that of all of the things that are of most pressing concern in their territory, tight pants must be addressed. Do you have any material on that, Tony? They apparently said to him, because we need you to bring our brothers in line on this issue. I don't believe that for a moment. I think it's far more likely that this is Tony's personal crusade, and he's just making it sound as though this is something that the Trinidad branch were concerned about.
So they're concerned. What is that all about? And sometimes it's hard to find one, in the stores, because they're pushing and advancing that. It's not appropriate. It's disrespectful to Jehovah God. It's not proper. Don't dress like that and say you represent the true God. And the same thing, because usually the sisters, you're waiting to hear it, because you hear it, but the men, look at it. And we've had to, in some places, circuit overseer has been told, don't you let them on the platform. See, because it's very sensitive and they hesitate. Well, we love you enough to tell you what it says here. That's not respectful to the God we worship to dress and detract from our message.
As I was saying at the beginning of the video, Tony, it's actually a little bit more than just not letting them on the platform with tight pants. One thing that you are, for some reason, failing to mention on this issue, and it's quite, it's quite relevant. I wonder why Tony isn't mentioning anything about the rule that you can actually be banned from going on the ministry if you insist on wearing immodest dress. I wonder why he's not mentioning that. You would think that it would be worthwhile mentioning that, but instead he's just saying, well, they might not get on the platform, or they shouldn't get on the platform. Nothing about this rule that circuit overseers have got written into their guidelines to say, no, they're not even allowed to preach. But you can let pedophiles preach. That's perfectly fine.
And with sisters, we don't want you to walk into an assembly hall or a kingdom hall, and you walk in, and because your clothing is revealing, the brothers go, whoop, I got to look away. That's disrespectful. What's that all about? You don't dress at the Kingdom Hall like you're going to the beach. It's not appropriate. And sometimes the dresses are so tight, and they're thinking, yeah, but with a figure like this, no. The world thinks that way, not Jehovah's people. It's disrespectful. Now, it's got to be tight, inappropriate. We're not talking taste. And I like to tease the brothers because some of them like to wear these, I call them happy socks. Hey, that makes you happy, go ahead. That's taste. They're socks. They're not tight suit pants or a tight skirt, tight dress. And it really is fundamental because if you look at 2 Corinthians 6, Jehovah's very clear about this, so your branch committee loves you enough to put the caution out, and believe me, your branch territory is not alone. And some are going to heed it, and the others that don't, well, Jehovah's going to deal with it. And really, that kind of disrespect, you want to break Bible principles, you're headed toward breaking law. It happens all the time. So it's not a light matter.
I'm going to be honest, I have no idea what happy socks are. I've tried Googling, and there's a company called Happy Socks. I don't know what, are they just kind of colourful socks? That's what it seems like to me. But the logic seemed to be that it's different if they're socks. So if you have stockings or leggings or some kind of sock, then that's a different principle. Even though it has the same effect of a tight-fitting trouser leg, it's a sock, so that's what you expect. But the minute it becomes a trouser leg and not a sock, then we have a problem, because then it's revealing. And he has this extraordinary brief rant about sisters and immodest dress, where he basically blames women if the men look. So if the men are prone to kind of perving on them or whatever, it's the woman's fault. Well, look what you've made the man do. That is really, really dangerous, irresponsible rhetoric for someone in Tony's position to be coming out with. It amounts to, well, if we were to kind of carry it into the context of rape, it would be we'd call that blame the victim. We are all adults. We are all responsible for how we interact with each other, and we're responsible for how we interact with members of the opposite sex. And when it comes to clothing, I'm sorry, but how far are we intending on taking this? What exactly is revealing versus not revealing? Because Muslims have their own idea of what is or isn't revealing. Are we supposed to start making sisters wear hijabs? Because that's the end game here. Tony seems to have a problem with contours. That's what it all boils down to. I'm sorry. So if a mere contour, whether the skin is showing or not, if a mere contour is enough for Tony to get excited, then A, that says more about Tony than it does about anything else. And B, what's the end game, Tony? Should all witnesses start wearing hijabs? And notice that again, all of this is buttressed with threats. I'm sorry, but these are the rules that I'm laying down here. And if you are disagreeing with me, if you are sniggering at me, if you're going against my advice, then you're going against God.
Now here's one with the... If I have opened the door to such satanic influences, will my love for Jehovah and his righteous principles impel me to act decisively and slam that door shut? Spiritual families are going to slam the door. Get rid of it. Don't bring it in the house. No. And are they unique productions? Well, like I said, we never said the devil wasn't smart. God condemns it, period. Has no place with spiritual families.
So if you're confused at this point, it's because we've actually skipped forward in the talk. I did contemplate giving you the entire talk, but it quickly became apparent. I mean, the original talk was, I think, something like an hour and 5 minutes, and I need space as well to do my rebuttal. And frankly, some of this talk is very, very tedious to listen to. I mean, I've already mentioned a lot of this is very incoherent, and if you were to write down what Tony's saying and read it out, it's a little bit like reading out what Donald Trump says. It doesn't really make any sense when you read it out. It's only when you're kind of watching him, and if you're kind of on his wavelength, you can sort of make out what he's saying. There are large spans of the talk where he's just rambling, basically. But this part of the talk is where he's referring to entertainment. So we've moved on from dress and grooming. We're now in entertainment. He's talking about entertainment, movies, games, books that deal with the occult, that normalize the occult, that are dealing with vampires and werewolves and what have you. And here Tony is saying that that stuff needs to be stamped out. There can be no room given for it. Witnesses are to completely turn their backs on it. This stuff apparently is directly from Satan. And, frankly, thinking about it, growing up as a witness, this stuff does have an impact. Because the way I used to think of it, or the way I was told to think of it, was that if you are watching a TV program and it's something that touches on spiritism, or ghosts, or vampires, or witches, magic, you name it, that the spirits are actually able to enter the house through the TV set. That's the way I was made to think of it. And although he doesn't say that, I'm pretty sure that's what's going to be going on in people's heads when he's talking about closing the door on Satan.
So, here's something to think about, you parents now. This is to help, and I want you to consider this. Let's say with your prayers, if you're a single parent, it applies as well. When you bow your head to pray, whether it's if you're having family worship or at a meal or at some other time, you bow your head to pray with your family. Could your child or children tell just about word for word what you're going to say every time? Now, that's not meant to, it's just, you got to think about that. That's another religion does that kind of praying. And some others might follow their example. Now, one thing you can consider, you make a mistake, let's say you're a dad and you've got your child, your children, and then you say to them, I overreacted, I didn't have the facts, forgive me, and then you pray to Jehovah, and then the child hears you asking Jehovah to forgive you for your imperfection. Oh boy. See, now you're into the spiritual, the spirituality that's so crucial. Prayer is vital to a family spirituality. And one father I know dealt with a lot of issues with elder work and such, and he'd come into the bedroom of his sons when they were sleeping, might be 11, 12 at night, get down on his knees, especially after maybe a judicial case, and beg Jehovah to give him the wisdom to reach the heart of these sons of his, that Jehovah would raise him and they'd serve him forever. Prayer makes a difference.
I've actually heard Tony talk about this before. I'm pretty sure he mentioned all of this in his Rome talk 4 years ago. But I just thought I'd include this in the video because there's two things he's saying here that I find quite hypocritical. So he chastises parents whose prayers in front of the family are repetitive. He said, could it be that your children could almost guess word for word what your prayer is going to be the minute you start your prayer? Well, isn't Watchtower's teaching fairly repetitive? Isn't it so that we, well, I say we, I'm no longer a witness, but witnesses get the same message drilled into them time after time, week after week, Watchtower article after Watchtower article. When it's Watchtower that's just simply repeating itself, well, that's fine. When it's the parents who, by necessity, frankly, have to repeat themselves, because what else is there to add? I mean, there has to become a point where if you're praying every single day and in front of every single meal, you're going to end up repeating yourself. It's a very, very hard trick to pull off, to have new material each and every time you say a prayer when it's, multiple times per day. And I find it hypocritical for Tony as a governing body member to be talking about repetitiveness. And he also talks about the need for family heads or for parents to show humility by apologizing in front of their children when they make mistakes. He says, for example, you could say, I overreacted, I didn't have the facts. This is the sort of acknowledgement parents need to make in prayer in front of their children. But when it comes to the governing body, when it comes to their industrial scale cover-up of child molestation, when it comes to their failed predictions, their teachings that impact on people's lives, their tinkering in sex lives, the sexual repression, the denying people higher education, all of this, no apology needed. And that is one thing that you will never find in Watchtower literature. They freely say, oh, well, we are imperfect, we're not infallible, we make mistakes. But as I have repeatedly argued, if you are going to make mistakes, or if you acknowledge that you can make mistakes, you also need to be apologizing, because inevitably you will make mistakes that are worth apologizing for. And that is one thing that is absent from both the words of Tony Morris and Watchtower literature in general. They will not admit when they screwed up.
And how about envy? Oh, that's a wicked one. and it leads to other worse things. But the one particularly after strife, quarrelsome. Now, let's be reasonable. I've been married for many years, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have never had a disagreement with my wife. That's a lie. God hates liars, so I'm not going. So you'll have times where you might have a quarrel, but this is not an ongoing thing. What the Bible is talking about is a practice of strife, quarrels, always quarreling. Boy, does that damage a child or children. But that's what fleshly families do. They're fighting all the time. And they say, well, that's my culture. Excuse me. Get it out of here. This is God's organization. You do not talk to each other like that and practice it. So I'll just tell you a cute story so you understand how Jehovah views and the thinking of the world. Well, yeah, you got to remember they're from such and such a place. They do that all the time. Now, I'm not saying I know, I have some Italian in me, and I've been to Italy. They do get loud, but they're really not. I thought they were quarreling, but they weren't. What do you mean? Who's fighting? We're just talking about this, really. So I'm not saying some are not louder than others. That's culture. But we're talking, a quarrel when it's a quarrel. You can see it in their face. So this father comes home from work, and when he drives in to his driveway, he runs over his little boy's bike. Man, he is just really angry. So he comes storming in the house, yelling at his wife, I told you to tell that punk to pick up his bike. Don't ever leave in the driveway. I ran over it now because you didn't do what I told you to do. And she yells back at him, and then she goes over and yells at her little boy, you little brat, I told you don't leave your bike out there, and just letting them have it left and right. House is full of strife. And then the little boy, where does he go? He goes over and the dog's just sitting there, so boom. He gives the dog a couple of kicks. Who's he going to go to? Well, the dog looked at him and he started wagging his tail and came up trying to make friends. Only Christian in the house was the dog that behaved Christian. That's how you react to, as Jesus instructs we're supposed to. See.
So, I've actually included this. It's rather a long, rambling, cute story is, I think, what Tony describes it as. We're repeating ourselves now because if you listen to the full Rome talk, I'm actually going to put a link in the description for those of you who want to listen to that. It is a translated talk, so you have to kind of wait for the translation as you're listening. But he's basically repeating the same talk that he gave 4 years ago in Rome. He gives the same story, or it's not even an anecdote. I think it's just completely made up. It's kind of a joke, I guess, of a man coming home and basically being abusive, and everyone in the household suffering abuse, including the animal, the dog. And the punchline is, and the dog was the only Christian in the house. And because, again, Tony is charismatic, and also the audience sort of fears him as God's representative, he just automatically gets a laugh. You're just gonna get a laugh. If you are a governing body member and you crack a joke, how can you not get a laugh? But just also interesting to see what I feel is a quintessential example of Tony's speaking style and teaching style, and the fact that it's kind of unraveling. I really do believe, I'm convinced watching this talk that Tony's most cogent most persuasive years as an orator are behind him, and he's starting to come undone now, to the point where listening to him, you're kind of feeling sorry for him a little bit, that he can't string his thoughts together as well as perhaps he used to in the more dynamic years that are now behind him.
Now, finally, we want to address this, and it's connected with a thought that was found in the text with our verse here in Ezekiel 33, and this is something that spiritual families heed the warning about. Ezekiel chapter 33. And let's read verse 8 and verse 9. When I say to someone wicked, wicked one, you will surely die, but you do not speak out to warn the wicked one to change his course, he will die as a wicked man because of his own error. But I will ask his blood back from you. But if you warn someone wicked to turn back from his way and he refuses to change his course, he will die for his error, but you will certainly save your own life. So spiritual families understand how serious this is. As the Watchtower brought out, the Apostle Paul could say he was clean from the blood of all men. His conscience was clear on that because he was so involved and zealous in the field service. So spiritual families understand how serious this is. Some can't do maybe as much as others, but we have, as Christians, the God-given responsibility to warn others. So you just take a look, and this is the idea Jehovah is getting across, at your hands. And you look at your hands now, only God, as he looks at your hands in here and all those that are tied in, does he see blood there? The humans sitting next to you, they might have an idea because they know you well and you haven't been out in service in weeks. Well, guess what? Most likely God's seeing some blood all over your hands. Or they go totally inactive, and we appeal to them, we try to help, but you cannot water down what God says here. If your hands are not clean because you've been out warning, then they have blood on them, and you're going to lose your life. It's what it is. It's a reality. And this is encouraging, too, because some say, well, you know, he didn't say you have to make at least 3 disciples to get life. No. We bear fruit by our preaching. Some of us have had the glorious privilege of people coming in the truth. Others have tried, you know, it's depending on territory and such. But as long as you're out there warning and doing your best, you're going to get life. It's not dependent on if you studied with someone and they came in the truth. That's not true. Even though that is the result of we're doing our best to try to teach. So keep in mind, spiritual families, they keep their hands clean from the blood of all men. See? So only you, between you and Jehovah, can keep your hands clean. You can't do it for your teenager. They have to accept the responsibility to get their own hands clean.
So bear in mind, this is a man who, in a morning worship episode, as I discussed in Taking on Tony number 3, this is a man who insists that the governing body is not dogmatic. What we've just seen, apparently, is a non-dogmatic governing body member expressing an idea in a non-dogmatic way. And yet, if I understand this correctly, I'm pretty sure I do, he got the audience in Trinidad to look at their hands. He read a scripture which was Ezekiel 33 verses 8 and 9, And he said that if they're not regular in the preaching work, if they are in the habit of missing the preaching work for, I think he said, weeks at a time, or if they're just not doing their best, they have blood on their hands. Because according to Ezekiel 33, verses 8 and 9, God's going to ask the blood back from the wicked person he destroys if a Jehovah's Witness fails to warn them. So if you don't engage in the preaching, this is very worthwhile thinking about if you happen to be watching this channel as someone who's never been a Jehovah's Witness, you're just interested. I know there are a few of my viewers who are like that, and I appreciate it. This is a fascinating example of the fanaticism with which the evangelical work is viewed by Jehovah's Witnesses. They literally think, and I'm not exaggerating because you've just heard it yourselves, they literally think they too will die at Armageddon. Despite being good people, doesn't matter how moral they are, doesn't matter how Christian they are, if they're not sufficiently engaged in the preaching work, they too will, well, the actual words were, you're gonna lose your life. That's how fanatical Tony is. That's how fanatical the Jehovah's Witness religion is. It's just that, again, it takes someone like Tony with a microphone in front of his bloated face for us to understand this, for us to finally get the true message behind all the flowery language in the publications. And another thing that's worth kind of pausing and thinking about is, and I'm actually going to mention this, or I am mentioning this in my forthcoming book, which is designed to help people get out of Jehovah's Witnesses. This, if you think about it, is another attack on inactive ones, because he specifically mentions inactive ones. And he says that this is a major problem. If you go inactive, then by default, you are essentially worthy of destruction at Armageddon because you are blood guilty. You're failing to warn your fellow man. And that's why when you do go inactive, when you try and fade, you almost inevitably find yourself shunned regardless. I mean, it's not quite the same as when you're disfellowshipped, but I mean, there is still some kind of warm feeling to a degree, but you're looked down upon. You're viewed as bad association. You are viewed as, not the finished article. And actually more than that, in the words of Tony Morris, you're going to lose your life if you don't turn around and get back to preaching. That's how seriously they take it.
Now, in conclusion, let's look at Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8. So we considered a lot of things to have families meditate on, and it might feel for some that maybe weak in more than one area, or all of them possibly. Well, start heading in the right direction. That's Jehovah's reasonable, but you got to turn it around. Because if we don't tell you these things, then there's blood on my hands. Not going to happen.
Jehovah's reasonable, but you've got to turn it around, is Tony's message. If you almost inevitably are falling short in one or more areas that he has highlighted, from failing to preach sufficiently, to wearing pants that are too tight, to goodness knows what else, goodness knows what other areas of Tony's personal opinions you're not squaring up to. But apparently Jehovah's very reasonable. He's giving us time to turn around before he destroys us for not doing so. That's very, very reasonable.
For it is not in subjection to the law of God, nor in fact can it be. So those who are in harmony with the flesh cannot please God. So he's very clear here. Fleshly people, it's death. The physical families, and some apparently want to have their own way, and they'll experience that out of existence forever. And if you love Jehovah, you want to live forever because you appreciate how it's going to be so wonderful to have him totally ruling everything in this universe.
Yes, how wonderful it will be to live on a paradise earth, again, landscaped over the remains of the tight pant wearers and those who have failed to do sufficient hours on the ministry, and everyone else who has been slaughtered at Armageddon, including all those people in the supermarket. How wonderful it will be to live on a paradise earth free of all of these heinous criminals that's ruled over by Tony. Tony is, after all, an anointed Christian. He will be ruling. This is what you have to believe as a Jehovah's Witness. If you're watching this, I'm sorry. You have to believe that this man is going to be put in charge of the planet as a king priest with Christ, along with the rest of the 144,000. And this is something that we're to look forward to, even though we can see in a very obvious way just how small-minded he is, just how judgmental he is, just how intolerant he is, and how prone he is to thinking of things in us versus them, black and white terms. You're either a spiritual family who agrees entirely with his ideas, or you're a physical family, and if you're a physical family, guess what? You are worthy of death.
So, but it does mean life and peace if we mind Jehovah's Spirit, if we do the spiritual thing. And just for the sake of illustration for you families to consider, we'll just address mothers. And for the sake of illustration, it's here, and we don't know what they're going to be calling it, but you're still living on this island. I can't promise you it'll be called Trinidad. I don't have any idea. I think you'll remember, oh yeah, or some other island that might be from, we don't know. But you're here, and I tell you, you think it's beautiful now? You haven't seen anything yet. Let's see. What he's going to do with all these rice fields and former sugarcane fields. Oh, this place is just going to be, whoa. See, in the places they're living. Well, anyway, in this island, whatever they're calling it then, it's the same one. God let you stay here because he's going to decide where everybody lives. You know, they all say, I'm going to have my house here. And I'm like, okay. You know, it's nice to have certain things, but God directs our steps. We'll see, you know. But good chance so you stay living here. Well, these two mothers that living here on Trinidad, but it's 1,500 years from now.
So mercifully, we are winding to a close in Tony's talk, and we have another one of his cute stories. It's not a real thing, obviously. He's talking hypothetically about something in the distant future. It's just purely something he has made up for the purpose of making a point that I'm sure with a bit of thought he could express more efficiently than this. But what's funny is he gives this illustration that depends on the audience being able to imagine paradise. And what's hilarious is that he almost realizes when he's actually in the middle of telling the illustration, it's like the penny drops and he thinks, okay, I've completely forgotten that I am in paradise. I mean, here, just as an example, here is some drone footage of Trinidad. This is what his audience are familiar with. And yet Tony has launched into an illustration where he has to make them believe that the paradise will be better than this. That causes him to enter into this awkward phase of trying to persuade his audience that the paradise that they can look forward to, it'll be so much better. You just couldn't imagine. Once all the rice fields and sugar plantations are out of the way, you should just see it. So I just found that funny, but I thought I would also include the same part from the Rome talk 4 years ago, so that you can see how repetitive, and remember we were saying before about him criticizing parents for praying repetitively, just so you can see how repetitive Tony is being, and so that you can get a more coherent version of this paradise illustration. Allow me to play for you the same comments from his Rome talk 4 years ago.
It's 500 years after the 1,000-year reign has finished. 500 years after the 1,000-year reign. 1,500 years into the future. And there's two mothers there that had children, and they're having a conversation. So let's listen in on their conversation. We've been living for some 1,500 years plus now. I've not thought lately about life during those last days of Satan's system. Every time I visit my children, I thank Jehovah God that during those vicious, peerless last days, when Satan was attacking all Christian families, our family survived, because as a spiritual family, we listened, we obeyed, and we were blessed.
So that was Tony giving the exact same illustration 4 years ago in Rome, and we're now going to come back to the Trinidad talk and notice how his ability to convey this illustration just seems to have deteriorated.
But it's 1,500 years from now. 1,500 years. And the two of them are together, and they're discussing this because they live by each other, known each other for centuries now. And the one says to the other, these are mothers, and they say, and I think she's probably still going to have a little Trinidad fling there, nice accent, whatever language it's going to be. Can't guarantee it's going to be English. But they're talking to each other. And the one says, because they're planning, the two are going to get together and they all know each other and they're having their family over. Both families really close to each other. And the one mother says to the other, I haven't thought about the last days of Satan's system for quite a while. But it seems that every time we get one of these nice get-togethers with my children, and then I see you with your children, we're all together. It just reaches inside me. And I say, thank Jehovah that during those critical last days, we listened to him and obeyed him.
So that was Tony's talk in Trinidad. Again, if you're taking notes, this was given on Saturday, January the 13th, 2018. So literally just this last Saturday gone. That's how recent this video is. And if I'd have been in the audience as a believing Jehovah's Witness, if I wasn't already having doubts, I can't see how I wouldn't have serious questions about how the organization can possibly be God's one true channel if this is the kind of person who is making all the decisions. I mean, he had two kind of rambling illustrations, one involving the brown-headed cowbird, which he couldn't even deliver the punchline so that witnesses could understand how the illustration applied to what he was talking about. It only makes sense if you cross-reference the exact same talk that he gave 4 years ago. And then he gives a number of cute stories, which are just kind of, they're not real, they're just stuff that he's come up with in his head. One involving an abusive family, and one involving a conversation that hasn't happened and won't happen in a paradise, which basically is, I mean, you can just simply say, in the future, witnesses will say to each other, aren't we glad that we remained loyal and obedient? Because otherwise we'd be dead. That's the essence of the conversation, the fictitious conversation that he's relating, but it takes him so long to get there. Longer than it took him 4 years ago when he gave the same illustration. I honestly think that Tony's losing it. I don't know what the reason is. Could it be, some have said, I've heard people say that he sounds like he's drunk. It could be that he's on some kind of medication. But at the end of this talk, he looks like he can't get off the platform fast enough. He looks confused. And if I were a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I don't think this would bode well for my confidence in the organization. If you have this kind of man, not just the kind of disjointed, incoherent, babbling delivery, but also how dogmatic it was, and policing Jehovah's Witnesses' lives to the degree of driving home this ridiculous tight pants rule, and even telling them that if they don't go on the ministry enough, they're going to die at Armageddon. And painting a very vivid picture as well of how traumatizing. He said it's going to shake you up. Apparently Tony is the only person who understands, thanks to his Vietnam experience, the PTSD from which all witnesses are now suffering from, thanks to Tony's delusions. Apparently it's only Tony who can foresee how traumatic it will be. It's going to shake you up. So this is the leadership. And I've been saying from when I first started my activism, when I first started doing my getting to know you videos, which you can still find on my other JW Survey channel, much smaller channel. But I honestly think that one of the best ways of waking up from your indoctrination as a Jehovah's Witness is just look at the leaders. Look at the leaders and what they're saying when they get a microphone put in front of them, and look at the judgmental, nonsensical babble that starts spewing out of their mouths when they get an audience who they know will lap up their every word and clap at everything, regardless of how outrageous it is. So, those were my thoughts on Tony's Trinidad talk. I do understand that probably some of you might want the whole talk, maybe for the purpose of showing relatives. I'll figure out a way. I'm mindful about copyright, so what I've shown you, I can show you illegally because I'm providing criticism and commentary of it. I can't just post the whole thing to YouTube because that would be in breach of copyright law. But I'll try to figure out some way of getting the whole talk to you in some way, even if it's through someone else. I don't know. We'll figure something out. But I hope you have enjoyed this video. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos. And as always, thank you for watching.